Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to another class, another lecture in the RCIA series, second day in May, and the month dedicated to Our Lady, her Immaculate Heart. It's also a day we don't celebrate it because it's Sunday, the feast of Saint Athanasius, who was a great saint in the 3rd century and was a stalwart fighter against the heresy of Arianism. Arius was a bishop from the East who decided that, in fact, Christ was not the Son of God. And it was a heresy that troubled the 3rd century for quite some time. And Athanasius was probably the single greatest force that not only opposed it, but eventually defeated it. So today we're going to be talking about virtue, which is shall we say, a culminating lecture in this series, because it takes the things that we've learned in the past about Christ, his church, the sacraments, and so forth and so on, and now actually gives you an avenue in which to put those things into action, which, as we will see, is an extremely important aspect of our faith. So let's begin with a little story which no one really knows if it's true or not. It was found in the writings of some of Thomas Aquinas's contemporaries, but Thomas himself never said this, nor did he write this, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating story that will launch our discussion of virtue today. So envision the 12th century Dominican father, Thomas Aquinas, in his cell toward the end of his life and writing, as he always did, writing philosophy, extending his thinking and his understanding of both Christ and Christ's effect in the world. And all of a sudden, at the end of the cell, appears a vision of Christ in all his glory. Well, Aquinas immediately falls to his face and adores the vision. But then after a couple of minutes, he looks at it. Something comes over his face. He stands up and says, "Begone, Satan." And the vision disappears and evaporates. And he tells this vision to his scribe somewhat later. And the scribe, sort of in awe, asks Aquinas, "Well, how did you know that that was not an image of Christ himself, that was not Christ appearing to you?" And Aquinas said, "I knew it because there were no marks on his hands or wounds in his side. And seeing that, I knew it couldn't be Christ." And so the lesson there, ladies and gentlemen, is that as we participate in the divine nature of God, so it is we must share in the divine activity, because God himself is pure act, unlike ourselves, which have potential and action. God himself is nothing but pure act. And as a result of that, one of his attributes is, of course, that he doesn't change. And so Aquinas, in looking at this figure of Christ, seeing that it didn't represent the action of Christ, knew that it was false and ordered it away. So in creation, God reveals himself. And this creation, this beauty that we see, sort of impels our belief. But it is grace which actually acts upon the soul, perfects the soul, and brings us, if you will, to our final end. And our final end, at least in this circumstance, in this particular context, is the doing of virtue, the bringing of virtue, the bringing of Christ into the world through our own actions, being his hands, if you will, and his feet. This is highlighted very well in a poem called Dies Irae, which means Days of Wrath. It was a medieval poem that was actually incorporated into the Roman Mass for the Requiem, the Mass for the dead. It was said just before the Gospel. And in that poem, it elaborates upon the parable of Christ's goats and sheep. You remember quite well where at the end of the world, Christ divides humanity into the goats and the sheep. And what distinguishes the two is not so much who did or who didn't believe in God. Nobody complains that they didn't know. What distinguishes them is what they did. So as Christ says to the sheep, "You're here because to the least of my brothers, whatever you did to them, you did to me. When you fed them, when you clothed them, when you counseled them, etc., that you did to me." And the goats are there because they didn't do that. Not because they didn't believe in God, but because they didn't do what their belief demanded, even if they said, "Lord, Lord." And we know again from the gospel that our Lord said that all those who say, "Lord, Lord," are not going to necessarily be saved. And so once again, in this poem, as in Aquinas' vision, we see that the distinction here is part of it, at least, is yes, it is very necessary to believe in God, but it's not sufficient. There's more to this belief in God. We actually have to do something. We actually have to comport with his will. We have to comply with his law. And the way in which that happens is through the process of virtue. So that we know that life is a gift. And as such, we have a responsibility to the giver in order to bring about his purpose in our lives. And this purpose, as I say, is to be found in virtue. So what is virtue? Well, a very simple definition, and a definition which will persist throughout this little talk, is that virtue is the habit of doing good. The habit of doing good. So there are three words, three parts to this that we have to understand. And again, I'm looking at some wonderful folks who are here, and yet my eyes are sort of focused on the camera here, so I will try to break away every now and then. And those of you who are in virtual land, please understand that I'm actually trying to engage and look at some other folks here. So forgive me if I sort of focus on the camera. It's sort of mesmerizing. So there are three parts to this that we have to come to grips with. The habit of doing good. The first thing we have to do is understand what a habit is. The last thing that a philosopher means when he talks about habit is the things we do mechanically. When I get up in the morning and I shave, and I probably shave the same way for the last 50 years. It's a habit. That's the way I shave. All of us have habits like that. Well, that's not what is meant here. A habit is actually a disposition. It's the soul drawn toward an action. It's the soul bringing to bear its intellect, its will, body and soul, heart, into a circumstance and trying to discern and understand what needs to be done in this particular circumstance. But that's a habit, a philosophical habit, in the sense that the soul is disposed to do that. Now, that's not something that happens naturally. We have to train ourselves. And the way in which we train ourselves, the way in which, if you will, this connection is made, is that the action of virtue actually purifies, but it polishes your character. Your character is the thing that distinguishes all of us. All of us have different characters. And why? Because we have different opportunities, different skills, different talents, different circumstances that we find ourselves in. And all those things, whether we recognize it or not, shape our character. So think of your character as sort of an accumulation of all of these qualities, which you express in time. That's how people know who and what you are, right? As Christ himself said, you know the tree by the fruit. So we know each other by what we do. And that's your character. And what forms your character is this practice of virtue. So there's a very deep connection there between the two of them. And so habit, yes, but what that really means is disposition. So the habit of doing, Aquinas is, and all philosophers really, but Aquinas will appeal to him. Aquinas is very definitive in the sense that you have to do virtue. Virtue is not something that we sit on the couch and woulda, coulda, shoulda. Virtue is actually getting out and doing something. Now, it doesn't have to be a great, magnificent thing. Aquinas isn't saying, and nor is God asking for your martyrdom as an example. Opening a door for someone is a small act of virtue, right? Helping someone in a circumstance where they could use that help, and maybe it's an inconvenience to you, is an act of virtue. There are all kinds of levels, if you will, of this act of virtue. But your action, your engagement in that circumstance, your recognition of what, again, the philosophers call the hierarchy of the moment. What's important at this particular time? What should I invest my time and my action in? Your recognition of that hierarchy of the moment is a virtue. And that virtue is an act of as I said, polishing, if you will, and even perfecting your character and your soul. Why? Because it's an expression of God's will, an expression of God's will. So, without God, as hopefully all of us both know and recognize in the culture and society we live in, man becomes his own end, his own purpose, his own means. And as such, he loses all sense of what his purpose is, why he's here on earth, what his talents are meant for, how it is that he comports with the will of God. He loses all sense of what we know as the natural law. The natural law is something that's implanted in each and every one of us. It's God's way of telling us what our purpose is and giving us guidance to that end, to what purpose is. So when we lose the sense of the natural law, we cut ourselves off essentially from God himself. And we don't cooperate with the graces that he gives us. And what that leads us to is an adoption of not really human liberty, but human license. Simply doing what it is that I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it, Why? Because that satisfies me. I become my own God. I'm the one that defines what law is. I'm the one that defines what the good is. And the good, very simply, is just simply in compliance with the will of God. If I don't have that connection, if I don't understand what natural law is, if I'm so focused on myself that I deny my obedience, my love of, and my recognition of my God and Savior, then I'm lost. I don't realize it, but I become trapped and enslaved to my own desires and my own wills. And that leads nowhere. And what happens as a result of that, and you see it around us, ladies and gentlemen, this is sort of the point that I'm driving at, is that we lose confidence in our religion, we lose confidence in our civilization, ultimately we lose confidence in ourselves. And you can tell that when you look around at not only a culture, but as individuals in the culture, when they are interested in vitiating the sacredness of life, when life doesn't mean that much to them, when life is more important that I have the ability to dispose your life than I actually get involved in your life. Or, we get involved in things like contraception and abortion. It's one of the classic examples, and it runs through history, of when a civilization begins to decay, when a sense of religion begins to decay, the first thing that kind of goes out the window is the understanding of the sacredness of the other, the understanding of the importance of your life. Why? Because you are made in the image and likeness of God. You have the dignity as being a son and a daughter of God. And therefore, I owe respect just simply based upon the fact that you exist. When that respect goes away, so my respect for life goes away. And we run into a circumstance that I think all of you are familiar with. I'm not going to elaborate on what we find today sometimes in some places in our culture. Another thing that happens is we deny the power of grace. You see, grace is a transforming thing. You remember or perhaps you don't, and I don't blame you if you don't, but the lecture we gave some time ago on the introduction to the sacraments. The whole point of the sacraments is this transfer of grace from God himself to your soul. And grace is a transforming thing. It's the very life of God. And if we deny the transforming power of grace, once again, we deny our relationship with God. We don't understand that we ourselves need that transformation. We need that conversion. We need that reorientation. And by denying not only the power of grace, but its very existence, we deny that whole possibility. And what do? We wind up relying again upon ourselves, which isn't the best place to be. We corrupt our purpose. The very essence of being human, beyond being a dog or a cat or what have you, is that we have an eternal purpose. We're here for a reason. Everything that we do, everything that we are, was crafted, was given to us, was envisioned for all eternity. You were envisioned and you were loved. And you were here on this earth in order to achieve that purpose, whatever it is. You think of, again, some of the great saints, you think of the great martyrs and so forth, people who invested their lives in the church and gave their lives throughout history. Then you think of other people, and the classic example here is Saint Therese of Lisieux. I hope all of you are familiar with her. She's one of the latest doctors of the church. There are 34 doctors of the church, I believe, that the church has recognized as being just supreme examples, if you will, of God's love, of his philosophy, of his theology. 33 people out of 2,000 years have been chosen. One of them, the last one, as I said, I think was Saint Therese of Lisieux. She died at the age of 22 or 23 of consumption in the latter part of the last century, that is the 1890s. Her whole life was spent in the kitchen. She cooked, she cleaned dishes, she did the laundry, she took out the garbage, she was a Carmelite nun. But what transformed her and what made her a saint was that every single little thing she did for the love of God. She understood it to be God's will that this is what she do. I'll fix that when we have to go. That this is what God wanted her and intended her to do. And she wrote about it, and she called it the little way. And so she is the saint of the little way, and was made a doctor, as I said, I think in the 1980s by Pope John Paul II. But an example of the fact that you don't have to be a martyr. You don't have to be someone that spends their whole life just absorbed in the church and simply being a church person, if you will. You can be, and you are, normal people with normal lives, normal responsibilities and commitments. But you can convert all of that to sanctity through the grace of understanding that all of this is what God wills for me. And no matter how, unpleasant it is and how dirty it is, I will do it because he's asked me to do it, just as Teresa Blasseau did. So corruption of purpose, when we lose a sense of purpose. Remember, purpose doesn't necessarily, again, have to be martyrdom. You don't have to be the President of the United States. We just live our lives as human beings. We confront the circumstances that we've been given. We take advantage of the opportunities that we have. We recognize the consequences in acting. And as long as we try to do that to the best of our ability to comport ourselves with God's will, we're on the road to sanctity. But it means understanding what your purpose is. The other thing to understand is the refusal of the transcendental. In other words, when we lose our sense of God, we obviously lose our sense of God. We forget the fact that beyond this material world that we exist in, there's something beyond this. There's something that gives import to this. There's something that draws us on. Even in the souls of people who have no concept of God or deliberately refuse to acknowledge God, there's things like for instance, the universal desire for all of us to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. The problem is how we define that. There's also a problem in the sense that none of us will ever be happy on this world. If you think you're happy, you get a new car, you get a promotion at work and so forth, wait a week, right? And that fades away. And all of a sudden there are other problems, other concerns in your life which degrade what you might call your happiness. So we want to be happy, but we've never known, none of us have ever really known exactly what happiness is. So all of us, even when people, as I say, are adamant atheists and they deny the transcendental, still there's something within us that's calling us to this transcendental. It's telling us that there's something beyond the material that we all confront and we all live in and we all face. There's something beyond that. And of course, we know that something to be God. And then finally, the last thing you might say is that this separation from God, this refusal to accept the natural law, also affects our civilization. It also affects our culture. We step away from the ideas of nobility. We step away from the ideas of mercy and sacrifice and commitment and responsibility. Now, by nobility, I don't mean being an aristocrat. What I mean there is the recognition that I am, in fact, made in the image and likeness of God. That I do have value. In fact, I have infinite value because the very second person of the Blessed Trinity, the Son of God, died for me on the cross. He didn't die for humanity. He died for you and for me. As he died on the cross, he beheld us as individuals and offered his life and the redemption that life gained for us to us as individuals. So always try to understand that. This isn't something that he did for all humanity, for the masses. He did it for all humanity, one individual at a time. Actually beholding us upon the cross. Actually offering his love and his suffering for you and me as individuals upon the cross. That's the nobility that I'm talking about. But you step away from God, you step away from the natural law, you step away from virtue, and all those things fade away. What nobility do people have? What sort of mercy and sacrifice am I supposed to engage in? What does it mean to commit to something? What's responsibility? All those words lose their meaning. And we can see that. We can see that, yes, in our own lives. We can certainly see it in the culture that surrounds us. And so as we dive now into this problem of virtue and what virtue is, let me read you a poem. It was written by William Butler Yeats right after the First World War. In fact, a couple of months after the First World War. And what he did, he was looking at the devastation, the material loss that the world had suffered as a result of the First World War. And he saw something more. He saw something deeper. And so he wrote about it. And some of the phrases in here, the verses and so forth, you're probably familiar with. You may have heard them, read them in other books, or heard people use these phrases and so forth. It's a poem that says an awful lot, but people, as I say, have actually taken a lot of what he said and use it in their everyday conversation. I'll bet you as I read it that you'll recognize some of these phrases. It's a short poem, not that long. So it's called The Second Coming. And you might think, well, the second coming of Christ, right? The second coming of God. Not so. The second coming. Turning and turning in the widening gear. A gear is a sort of an ancient English word for circle. So turning and turning in a widening circle. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are these words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi, the spirit of the world, Spiritus Mundi, troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it keel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what the rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Now, you've probably, as I said, heard some of those phrases. And of course, what is he talking about? Well, the rough beast is Satan. The rough beast is the evil that can exist in the world. And it's been wakened after 20 centuries by the First World War. I mean, that's its connection. The First World War, all the terror, the material destruction, has let loose the beast. And the beast is slouching where? Toward Bethlehem, because that's where the cradle is. That's where Christ is. And the beast is going to devour Christ. And once he devours Christ, what happens to the rest of us? What happens to our civilization? So he's looking deep into time, and he's seeing the decay not only of civilization and culture, but the loss of our souls. Because, you know, again, in his image, the First World War looses the beast, and the beast's, shall we say, object is the consumption of our souls, the consumption of us as individuals. So it's a very powerful poem, and it points to the fact that there is an opposition to this. There has to be an opposition to this. God himself isn't going to let this happen, but he requires our cooperation to make sure that it doesn't happen. And that cooperation comes through the exercise of virtue. So let's talk about that. Let me get this thing back up. Okay, so I hope you can see this. This is a graph, a slide I think I put up some time ago when we were talking about the introduction of the sacraments. So I'm not going to review this in a sense as I'm going to elaborate upon it based upon our understanding now of virtue and the importance of virtue. So recall this sentence here, which is out of Paul, and it's, as I said, one of the best sentences I found that sort of brings together the idea of grace, virtue, and the imitation of Christ. And that's the connection. It's all here in one sentence. God worketh in you, all right? He worketh through grace, through his very life in your soul, to will, that is to cause you to will, and that's what virtue requires. Remember, as I said, it's not something that we sort of sit on the couch and we kind of want to, shoulda, woulda, coulda. We actually have to do something, which involves animating the will and bringing the will to bear on particular circumstances. And why this connection of grace and virtue? So that you can imitate Christ. Because that's what Christ's life was all about. Right? Was the virtuous act, the virtuous life, which is what all of us have to aspire to. So you remember this little circle here where things start off, the very source of all of our faith, all of our belief of grace is the crucifixion itself. It is, in fact, shall we say, the antidote to modernism. It is what will defeat the beast that's slouching toward Bethlehem, is actually the crucifixion, the death upon the cross, this manifestation of love so supreme that God himself comes down and suffers this indignity so that all of us may be granted the opportunity for redemption and we can gain our salvation. And what this does, it teaches us, number one, that we all are morally responsible for what we do in life. You know, one of the things that our culture likes to tell us is, well, it's not your fault. You know, you didn't know that your environment caused you to do that, or what have you. Any kind of explanation, and there are a number of them that people like to either adopt or encourage other people to adopt. And what Christ says by the crucifixion is that's not so. You are responsible for what you do. You are responsible as I was responsible for my death upon the cross, as I accepted the will of my Father and acted in obedience to that will. So you are responsible for what it is you do and what you don't do. It also, by the very nature that it does that, it also emphasizes the importance and the sacredness of life itself. You have so much power and ability, if you will, that you can help and assist in determining your own disposition at the moment of death. Do you go to heaven or do you go to hell? It's not some sort of a random lottery that takes place. You are going to be judged by the extent to which you imitated Christ here on earth. And once again, it's not that everybody has to be a martyr. Many of us, like myself, I'm a garbage taker outer. That's what I do. At least that's what my wife tells me to do. Mm-hmm. See, so I mean, we have our own individual circumstances, our own talents and abilities, our own opportunities in life. And what we have to do is make the best of those, and make the best of them such that they in fact imitate Christ. So the crucifixion is actually this counter to modernity. It's actually the counter to this beast that's slouching through Bethlehem. Now, the trick for us is we have to cooperate with it. And remember what the church is? The church is where all the merits from the crucifixion are deposited. The church has the responsibility of providing these merits to all of us. And she chooses to do so through the sacraments, through prayers, through sacramental, through her teaching, through her examples. Those are the sources of grace that we have. The principal ones, again, being the sacraments, because the sacraments are the way in which God transmits to us sanctifying grace, the very life of God himself. And that grace is permanent in your souls until you drive it out by mortal sin, until you deliberately choose as a morally autonomous being to deny Christ and to commit, whatever mortal sin it might be, and choose to drive that grace out of your life. Now, one of the great joys, and I think we talked about this in that particular lecture, one of the great manifestations of God's love for us is that when we go to confession and confess those sins, all those merits and graces come back. In other words, they're sort of taken from you, and they're parked someplace, but when you come back, as we all must, they're given back to you. So it's a great manifestation of love. You don't necessarily destroy everything because you've committed a mortal sin, as long as you come back and receive penance, forgiveness for that sin. So, but here's the key for us today, ladies and gentlemen, is this connection between sanctifying grace and virtue. It's an astonishing transaction that takes place. This grace is something you can't feel or see, but it in fact exists and is the very life of God, imparted to your soul because you've worthily accepted a sacrament, or been involved in a sacrament, confession, or you've been to communion or what have you. And that is manifested in time and space, in your own life. In other words, your soul now has an understanding of how to connect itself to the spiritual and material reality that exists around you. The soul that isn't involved in this transaction, that isn't connected to reality, loses that sense. That's why there's so many people today who are literally lost in life, that literally fail to understand what's important and what isn't important, put emphasis in areas that they shouldn't, and don't value things that they should. Why? Because they're not connected to reality. As much as they might think they're very smart and they're materialists and they know what has to be done in certain circumstances, there's something missing. And what's missing, of course, is the transcendental. And it's the transcendental that gives meaning to what we do. Divorce yourself from that meaning and you don't understand reality. You don't understand why you suffer. You don't understand, you can't recognize the opportunities that are put in front of you. Remember, God will chase you like a hound until the moment of your death, giving you opportunities, trying to show you, trying to bring you back. He will never, ever come into your mind and grab you back. And you know why? Because he loves you. And he recognizes your dignity as a created image of him. And love itself, which is what is required here, love itself is something that you cannot force. In some examples, I've often said that any human being with enough power can force you to do anything that they want to, if they had enough power, enough time. But then one thing no one can ever force you to do is to love them. That's something, no matter how much torture, no matter how much pain is inflicted upon you, you will only love someone if you finally decide to do it. You know, if you make the choice to do it. And that's what God wants from you. He wants you to make a free choice to love him. And in so doing, comply with his law and comply with everything that we have here. But this is the great mystery, this transaction between the transcendent and time and space, and how that grace motivates us toward this accomplishment of virtue. And what virtue does is act on the intellect and the free will. Remember, the intellect is all about finding and holding on to and defending the truth. That's why we have minds. We're supposed to be looking for the truth, and once we found the truth, to hold on to it. And we have a free will so that we can act in accord with that truth. And basically, the free will here means essentially giving everyone his due. It essentially is an act of justice. That when I deal with people and I exercise my free will, I do so in recognition and respect of who and what you are, and in fairness. Not to exploit, not to take advantage of, but to treat you as what you are, a son and daughter of God. And that brings me to the idea of, okay, so intellect and free will, I know, love, and serve God. That's part of, that's not part, that's the whole purpose here. You know, love, and serve God in this world so you can be happy with him in the next. And that leads you to the imitation of Christ, and the imitation of Christ leads you right back to the crucifix. Always remembering that Christ himself, as he was going to Jerusalem, talked about the fact that when he was lifted up, and he meant when he was crucified, he would draw all things to himself. Everything would come to himself. And this, again, is why this is the counter to the beast that Yeats so poignantly talks about in his poem. The counter is the crucifixion. To escape the beast, you want to be found at the base of the crucifix. To escape the beast, you want to recognize who God is, what Christ is, and act in accord with the example that he's given all of us. Act in accord with this understanding of what virtue is. So let's talk just a little bit about the reality that we kind of find ourselves in. To understand, you know, not only the shall we say, the mission we face, the purpose we face as individuals, but the problem we face today in our culture and in our society, and not just in the United States, around the world. So you can see there are sort of three phases to this. There's the phase here of revelation. There's the phase of civilization, which is built upon revelation. And there's this phase up here of our cause and our end. So you proceed down here, once again, you find at the base of all of this, the crucifixion, right? And what the church does and what Christ gave the church is an extremely important act. And that is the act of the sacrifice of the Mass. So that the crucifixion is perpetuated through time. Quite true, Christ only died once on Calvary, but what you witness is the unbloody sacrifice. Again, relived, perpetuated through time. So that when we are at Mass and at the moment of consecration, the priest himself sacramentally becomes Christ. And the offering that you see is sacramentally the unbloody sacrifice of the cross relived. So that you and I are just as present as Mary and John and Mary Magdalene were at the foot of the cross on Calvary. Absolutely vital that we understand this, that the Mass is the perpetuation of this sacrifice through time. So that we're all have access to it, we all benefit from it. Not only spiritually, not only just thinking about it and reading about it, but materially, and actually receiving the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ our Lord. Actually being united with him physically. And it's this perpetuation which builds the church, right? The church has deposited all of that merits into it, all the merits won by this infinite sacrifice. It distributes those merits, in this case, to the seven sacraments, but there are other ways. The seven sacraments is the only way you get sanctifying grace. But there are other ways, there are other kinds of graces that we can get through prayer, through blessing ourselves with holy water and so forth. But the principal way here is through the seven sacraments. And then all of this influences now our theology. Our theology essentially is our belief. The wonder that we have in creation, the wonder that we have in God himself, our submission to his law, our willingness, our desire to love him. What theology does is sort of capture all of that. And it has been capturing it for 2,000 years. It helps us to understand and explain it. It investigates the attributes of God. Will it ever understand what the Trinity is? Of course not. but at least it understands that the Trinity is a mystery. And ladies and gentlemen, the beauty of a mystery is that it illuminates in and of itself. So the Trinity, three persons in one God, illuminates the absolute vast importance of the love that exists between those persons of the Blessed Trinity, and the love that is then manifested to us as the creatures, as those individuals made in the image and likeness of God. So theology, again, an extremely important thing which defines our beliefs, which takes all these manifestations down here, these physical manifestations that we see and we participate in, and helps us to sort of organize them intellectually and understand, believe, if you will, explain what it is we're doing and why. Well, the next, that's essentially, that's all revelation. Remember, revelation, of course, is God's revealing to us of his attributes, of his nature, of his purpose, of his intent. So revelation is what forms the basis of civilization. Civilization being the next phase here. And civilization itself consists of these three blocks: philosophy, culture, politics, and then you and me. So what's philosophy? Well, if theology is what I believe, philosophy is what I think. Okay, if I've got all this understanding of what God is and purpose and my relationship and so forth and so on, so what do I think about that? What are the implications of that for me? What are the imperatives that come out of that as a result of that? And that's what philosophy is. It's what we believe. It's where we find wisdom and meaning. It's a reflection on theology and a reflection upon the world around us, and it gives us these guidelines. It explains to us what wisdom is. Now, the problem we have here is, and of course, as soon as you get out of here, there are many philosophies out there, and many of them are terrible philosophies, if you read. So there is the problem of choosing and finding the right philosophy, the philosophy that best connects with the theology that we hold, with what we believe. Now, it's not exceptionally difficult. It just can be confusing at times. And the best place to start, obviously, is with someone like Thomas Aquinas, who was absolutely not only loyal to, but adhered to the theology he was given, and drew directly from that theology the philosophy that he presented. So as I said, it is a difficulty, it is a problem, but it's not one that doesn't have a solution. So if this is what I believe, this is what I think, culture is what I do. Okay, I believe things, this is what I think, I go out now and I do things. So culture is supposed to provide all of us a practical access to the first principles, to the moral principles which guide us. I mean, that's what culture is supposed to do. We act in culture. I mean, that's how we express ourselves, how we connect with ourselves. And if we, in fact, act in our culture with regard to the theology we believe and the way in which we think, our culture is going to be a good culture. We're going to find these first principles expressed in our relationship with each other. And so when you have that, then politics simply becomes the way of imposing order upon all of this. In other words, as the ancients said, politics is all about right order. So you don't find in philosophy and theology concerns about real estate law, right? Or traffic law, or any other kind of law you might think about. That's what politics is supposed to do. Being influenced by all of these things, politics says, okay, this is the best way, given our circumstance, that we're going to have traffic laws, and this is the best way we're going to convey property to each other, and this is what taxes are, and so forth and so on and on and on. That's what politics should be about. Then finally, you and I stand on all of this. You and I are, if you will, kind of an individual material expression of all of this, influencing us, shaping us, directing us toward what? Toward whom? Well, to God himself. That's our cause and our end, is again, union with God. So if everything worked perfectly, this is what it would look like. The problem is that everything doesn't work perfectly. And the reason for that is there's sin in the world. So let me just give you an example. How many of you, don't answer, it's just rhetorical. How many of you feel sort of uncomfortable with the way things are in terms of like political correctness and cancel culture and all the rest of that, right? You don't have to answer that question. Why is that? Why does it happen? It's because of this. Because people who engage in that, and now it's a very large portion of our population and certainly our academia, they take philosophy and all that's beneath that and they just simply discount it. God doesn't exist. Philosophy is whatever you want it to be, whatever you think. What's your personal philosophy? How do you empower yourself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is gone. And what they do is they take culture and politics and flip it. So now it's politics that drives culture. It's politics that tells you what to think and how to act. It's politics that provides you with your first moral principles, with the important things, the things that you have to do, the things you have to believe. And this is why it's sort of kind of messed up today, is because we've not only killed, 3/4 of this, but we've taken the two last things and we've just flipped them. And all of a sudden, when that happens, you aren't sort of the epitome, the expression of all of this. You're well, not necessarily a victim, but you're someone who has to comply. You don't really have a free will, a choice in all of this, because your culture is dictated by your politics. That is essentially the way a totalitarian government works. That is, if you study, communism, if you study Lenin, if you study Hitler and Goebbels and so forth and so on, their whole path, their means to power was to make politics the influencing element in culture. And in so doing, what they did was to divorce the individual from everything else that the individual relies upon for structure and for protection. Your family, your church, your professional associations, your hobbies, all of those things that we all engage in and we all enjoy. And they become, as I say, not props by any means, but they become supports for us. Certainly our family and our community is a prime example of that. But what a totalitarian government does, and what Satan does, is strip all of that away. And it's just me and you. It's just the power of the state versus you. There's nothing in between. There's no buffers. There's no appeal that you have. Imagine, you're a Jew in Germany in the 1930s, and there's a knock on the door at midnight, and it's the Gestapo, right? What do you say? Oh, just a second, I got to call my lawyer. No, it doesn't work, right? And the reason it doesn't work is because the only thing that exists is the power of the state and you as an individual. And when I want you, when I come for you, you've got no recourse. And that's exactly the way Satan works. What he tries to do is strip away from you everything that you believe, everything that you hold sacred, and force you to rely upon yourself. And then when he comes for you, you don't have a breath of a chance. You have no defense. Now, as we know, you do have a defense. All you have to do is just finally appeal to God, and the beast is chased away. But that's how it works. That's how it works. So the next thing, let's see, we have a little bit of time here. By 10:30, right? 10:30, yeah.
10:30, 10:25.
Yeah, okay.
10:35.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
went backwards. All right, so just to sort of briefly touch upon this, how does it work? How does grace, remember this sanctifying grace, produce virtue? What's the transaction that takes place? What's the mechanic that makes that work? Well, it's something called metaphysics, and we're not going to go into it. I mean, you could offer a whole semester's course on this thing called metaphysics, right? And metaphysics is the center of your being. Remember, Yates talks about the center doesn't hold. Well, when you refer that to an individual, to a human being, what that means is that our metaphysics breaks up. We no longer act in accord with our purpose. We no longer act in the way in which we were designed to act by God himself. But instead, we substitute things. We substitute erroneous beliefs. We substitute ideologies. We substitute simple, human desires as being the core, the center of our being. And in so doing, we break ourselves up. The center doesn't hold. Things fall apart. So metaphysics is essentially this replication. It's why we are made in the image and likeness of God. God himself has a metaphysics, except it's not as simple as this, right? Because God himself is act, pure act, and he doesn't change. Well, the problem with us is that we are not pure act. We have a lot of potential within ourselves, and we do change all the time, don't we? How many times I've looked in the mirror and said, who the hell are you? Where did you come from? So we change. And this is what sort of tries to explain that. So grace is the antecedent. In other words, to operate this, the fuel, if you will, to operate this idea of metaphysics, you need grace. And what emerges from grace is virtue, which is the expression of what our metaphysics is. So let's just talk about this very quickly. There are kind of 4 elements within our metaphysics. And I think the best way to talk about it is to use an example that Aristotle used. Think of yourself as a sculpture. Now you're a being. You are made in the image and likeness of God. You have a body and you have an immortal soul. And understand this, you are a human being because you have a body and an immortal soul. Those are not two separate and distinct elements. They are united. They're joined together within you as an individual, and they make you an individual. And as I said, because you come from the hand of God, thus defines your value. So you are a being. Let's say you're a sculptor. You want to sculpt a statue, a hero or something like that. You've been given a commission to do that. So the first thing you do is find potential, which is, say, a block of marble. And you act on that block of marble according to your talents and your skills and the ways you've learned to be a sculptor. And what you finally produce as a result of that is this statue. So the being is us. It's us as individuals defined as body and soul. The potential is the capabilities we have within ourselves. We all have potentials. We all have those abilities, levels of intelligence, talents, the opportunities we have, the circumstances we find ourselves in. All of those things are potential. And what we do is we act on that potential. We convert it into action, into something that's real. And that action produces our purpose. Theoretically, should align with our purpose, which is to know, love, and serve God in this world and be happy with Him in the next. So that's sort of the dynamic of metaphysics. And the idea is that we start off as individuals. All of us have a different, shall we say, construct, the same principle, but a different kind of way in which our metaphysics aligns, because we have different potentials. We have different ways of acting. We all have the same purpose, and we start from the same being, but it's these two things in here that are kind of different for each of us. So we start off with a kind of a sense of individuality, and that's one of the beauties of creation, is that we all are individuals. And by acting on this metaphysics properly, we struggle toward perfection. We struggle toward becoming like Christ, toward imitating Christ, becoming like God. But the antecedent to that, as I say, is grace. You've got to have grace. And the result of that, the expression of this dynamic, is virtue. So one of the important things, and we'll talk about this in a second, but is this idea of reality, understanding what reality is. Remember, as I said before, when you divorce yourself from God, when you divorce yourself from grace, et cetera, you lose a sense of what reality is. You forget that reality is indeed time and space, material, but it's time and space connected to eternal purpose. And in the moments of reality, we find opportunities. We're given opportunities all the time. And we also find consequences. What happens when I fail to do what I'm supposed to do, what I should do? Or what happens when, in fact, I do a good job and I comply and I produce, virtue or good or whatever it might be. So reality is more than just time and space. It's time and space connected to eternal purpose. And that connection provides us, as I say, with opportunities in our life. It also provides us with consequences. The consequences of doing well, the consequences of doing poorly. So it's grace that allows us really to sort of define and understand and engage in reality, to appreciate what reality is, to use reality in the sense and in the way in which God intended it to be used. And finally, on the other side of this, you've got virtue, right? The habit of doing good. And what virtue, by the practice of virtue, what it does, IOC, imitation of Christ. It brings us closer and closer to God. So that at that moment when all of us must face, when we're presented toward, to God in our final judgment, He looks upon our soul and we ask ourselves, and He asks us, how much do you look like my son? How much does your soul reflect what my son was and what he did? And that's the measure of salvation or damnation. And in fact, as the church fathers teach us, God doesn't damn us. We damn ourselves, because we recognize in that moment that, in fact, we have failed for whatever reason. Deliberately, we failed. We refused, His grace. We refused to acknowledge His existence, et cetera, et cetera. But this is sort of like the dynamic that sets that up. Our understanding of what reality is, grace used in reality to sort of fuel this process, and this process designed to produce our purpose. Whatever particular circumstances we find ourselves in life, the whole point of this is to produce our purpose, which is the practice of virtue, which then leads us to God. As I said, that's a very quick and probably not very comprehensive by any means example or look at what metaphysics is. You could take a whole course in this. It could be a whole semester in this. Read Aquinas, read Aristotle, read some of these other great philosophers, and they talk about what metaphysics is. But at least it helps you to understand that this is the core. This is the center that falls apart. This is the thing that the beast attacks, is to break up your understanding of who and what you are and what your purpose is, to break up that understanding and to substitute things that are deficient. Substitute love of myself, empowerment, whatever you can imagine as being something that corrodes like an acid this structure. And so what we have to do as human beings is maintain this structure to the fullest extent that we can. And the way in which we do that is to continually avail ourselves of grace through the sacraments, through attendance at the Mass, and through the practice of virtue, which again expresses this. That simple, beautiful key. You know a tree by its fruits. You can judge people by what they do, and that can tell you who they are. Let's take a look at the next one. Okay, so what is it that attacks all this? What is it that attacks all this? Well, here's again a simple example, an attempt to portray the tools of the beast, if you will. And right now, currently today, there are 4 basically prevalent philosophies out there that are inimical to our Catholic faith. Now, not that anybody in here or anybody anywhere else would say, well, I'm a determinist or I'm a relativist. Sometimes people don't even understand the ideas that they're dealing with. Where most of us, a product of is kind of a toxic mix of all this. We pick and choose, we put things together, and you come up with your personal philosophy, if you will. So relativism, existentialism, determinism, and empiricism. Relativism simply says you can't know the truth. You cannot know the truth. You don't have access to it. Your mind can't rise to it. And in fact, maybe the truth doesn't even exist. And what it produces in us in this are skeptics. Skeptics are people who essentially believe that you just can't know what's good. I have no way of judging what's good and what I should do in this particular circumstance because I can't know the truth. And my truth is obviously in direct opposition to your truth. And so I become a skeptic. I can't know what's good. So I just simply do what I want. Existentialism is this philosophy that says you are a meaningless element in the cosmos. The cosmos is entirely indifferent to you, could care less about you. And so what happens is you become a cynic. You become someone who is just, you divorce yourself from all convention, you divorce yourself from all relationship, and you just concern yourself with yourself. Well, okay, if the cosmos doesn't think, at least I do, at least I think I'm important. And so based upon that environment that you live in, which is an environment of nihilism, you try to make your way in life by just being concerned with yourself. Determinism is the philosophy that you don't have free will. You're influenced, you're made by either your fellows, you're like a member of a herd, or you are a product of your environment. That's a classic one. However people approach it, the bottom line is you don't have free will. You don't have the dignity of making decisions. Everything that you do is determined. Another approach, the scientific approach, is determined by your DNA. It's all in your DNA. So if you're a murderer or whatever you pick it, you're not really responsible for it. It's just because that's who and what you are. That's what your DNA dictates. And so you become a Stoic in the worst sense of the world. The Stoic in the best sense, in the ancient sense, was someone who acknowledged that he was, he endured life. He did the best he could. He made the best decisions he could, but he knew he was going to suffer. He didn't whine about it. That's what a Stoic was. Just someone who accepted what life was, didn't whine about it, did the best he could. Well, in this case, as a determinist, a Stoic is someone who just simply withdraws from life entirely, right? Because he doesn't have any free will. There's nothing he can affect. There's nothing he can do. So he simply just withdraws himself entirely from life. And then finally, you have the the empiricism, which essentially says that life is all about material. Life is nothing more than malleable material which you can shape and form. So you can shape and form individuals. Now, the worst example of this is something that's very prominent today, and that's transgenderism, right? Where man is considered to be nothing more than just material, which we can cosmetically shape and form and so forth. And we can satisfy what you think are your desires by manipulating you physically. And that's enough. We don't have to worry about the soul. We don't have to worry about your nature. We'll just change you physically. And so what that produces is an Epicurean. An Epicurean is one who simply believes if all there is just what I can sense out there, if all there is material, then the whole point of life is just, use that material to my pleasure. Use that material to satisfy myself. That's what an Epicurean is. So if you take a look at these, and we'll talk about these in a second here. If you take a look at these, what you've got is relativism, cutting yourself off from God. Determinism, cutting yourself off from your culture. And empiricism and existentialism, cutting yourself off from your fellows, from those around you, from your culture. And when you cut yourself off from God, your culture, and individuals around you, what you do is you build a box around yourself, right? You make yourself that isolated being who doesn't understand reality, who doesn't understand his purpose, and who is exposed, to the power of the state, but more importantly, to the power of the beast. Because there's nothing. You don't even accept that there's anything out there that can help you. You don't accept transcendence. You don't accept grace. You don't accept the fact that you're a morally responsible being for whom some God offered you the opportunity of redemption through the great act of his love of sacrificing himself on the cross. All of that is lost. And so as a relativist, you destroy your intellect, you live in falsehood. As an existentialist, you destroy your heart, you live in self-delusion. As a determinist, you destroy your soul, and you live in a life of irresponsibility. As an empiricist, you destroy your body, and you essentially just live in this world of fantasy. Now, that forms this box around you, and what happens is, the worst thing of all, is that by forming that box around you, what you do is you tear yourself apart. You don't even remain an integral being anymore. You're so divorced from reality, so separated from the grace that can save you, so convinced of your own material, your own worthlessness, if depending on where you are in this, that you tear yourself apart. And now you find your satisfaction in things like drugs or alcohol or whatever it might be, But you lose a sense of who and what you are, and your soul is at war with itself. So the response to this, there are 4 virtues that are called the cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. They are the immediate effect of the theological virtues, which are faith, hope, and charity. Faith, hope, and charity are instilled in you upon your baptism. When you're baptized, they're instilled in you. So faith is your belief in God. Hope is your belief in his promises, that he's offered you salvation, redemption, that his desire is to be united with you in heaven. And charity is your love of God. If I believe in him, if I hope in his promises, well, then I love him because of the absolute love that he's shown me. And it's like a little engine: faith, hope, and charity. The more I love God, the more I have faith in him, the more I hope in him, the more I love him, the more I have faith in him, etc. It's like a little engine that exists within your soul at the moment of baptism. Okay, has its source in God, has its object in God. But the thing about charity is that, yes, I love God, but I also love the things that God created. Yeah, my fellow human beings, this world, the universe. I love those things because they are manifestations of God's power and his love and his greatness, his omnipotence. And that's where the rest of these virtues come. And the very first kind of virtue that comes after the theological virtues are what are known as the cardinal virtues. These are the virtues that we gain through practice, through living our lives and doing the best we can. These are the virtues that perfect me interiorly, that prepare me, if you will, for entry into to my culture, for life in my family, whatever the circumstance might be. But they are the way in which I perfect myself internally. So prudence is the regulation of the mind. And that's what counters relativism. Fortitude is the regulation of my will, in other words, my soul. It convinces me of the purpose that I have in life and gives me the strength to adhere to that purpose. And that's what counters existentialism. Justice, again, is this virtue which talks about giving every man his due. It forces me out of myself. I can't withdraw. I can't become someone that's irresponsible in my culture. I've got to engage in my culture. Why? Because that's the way in which I engage with you. And the whole point of justice is that I give to you what is due to you as a child of God, as someone made in the image and likeness of God, someone to whom has immense dignity and to whom I owe respect for that dignity. And then finally, we have temperance, which is all about the regulation of your appetites. We all have appetites. And guess what? They come from God. And guess what? They all serve a higher end. So the purpose of temperance is to regulate those appetites so that I don't fall into the trap of thinking that it's nothing but pleasure and living a fantasy life based upon my appetites, like an animal, just being driven by my appetites. What do I do now? What do I eat next? Whatever the case might be. Temperance helps me to regulate my appetites, as I say, and direct them toward a higher purpose, the purpose that God has given me. So it's these four cardinal virtues that are the direct, immediate, if you will, counter to the beast. The virtues that can, in fact, break this whole thing up, break out this little box, heal you as an individual, and bring you back into life by reconnecting you with God, reconnecting you with your culture, and reconnecting you with your fellow human beings. And that's what reality is. Time and space driven by eternal purpose, right? In which I have opportunities and in which there are consequences for what I do because I'm a moral agent. And that's what virtue is, ladies and gentlemen, a habit of doing good, the habit of bringing God's purpose, God's grace, God's sense of what it is, who and what it is we are into play in our lives. And in so doing, affect the lives of others. And the key to it is grace. The key to it is grace, is staying at the foot of the crucifix, which you can't see behind there. Anyway, I guess they moved it. They moved that one to the crucifix? Yeah, they moved that one too, I guess. Anyway, staying at the foot of the crucifix, which is the source of grace. And then taking that grace, allowing it to perfect your soul, allowing it to stabilize your metaphysics, who I am, what my purpose is, what potential I have, and how I act, to bring all of those in coherence with each other. And as a result of that, to produce virtue in my life, to be like unto Christ. So that at that final moment, when I, as we all will, present ourselves, God can look into that soul of yours and say, come, my child, who is an imitation of my son. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can you end with a prayer?
Oh, sure. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Our Lady, Queen of Wisdom,
Pray for us.
St. James,
Pray
Pray
for
for
us.
us.
and today's saint, St. Athanasius.
Pray
Pray
for
for
us.
us.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So thank you.
Thank you.